The classroom was silent, uncomfortably so. Every pair of eyes stared at the scene unfolding at the front of the room. The teacher, a tall, stern-faced man with sharp eyes, stood with his arms crossed, looking down at a student who had just been humiliated in front of everyone. The boy sat still, his back straight, his hands resting on his desk. His skin was dark, his features calm, too calm. But there was something in his eyes. A quiet fire. A storm waiting to break. The teacher smirked, glancing at the other students. And this, class, is what happens when you think you're smarter than your teacher. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room, but most students remained silent, exchanging uneasy glances. They had seen this teacher do it before: target students, pick them apart, humiliate them until they either broke or learned to stay in their place. But this time felt different. The boy didn't react the way the teacher expected. He didn't stammer an apology. He didn't shrink in his seat. He didn't even look embarrassed. Instead, he simply held the teacher's gaze. Steady. Unflinching. That look unsettled the teacher more than he wanted to admit. "Do you have something to say?" the teacher asked, his voice laced with mockery. "Or are you finally realizing your mistake?" The boy tilted his head slightly. "A mistake?" His voice was calm, controlled. "I didn't make a mistake." The air in the room changed. The teacher's smirk faltered. A flicker of irritation passed over his face. He wasn't used to students talking back, especially not ones he had just publicly put in their place. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sharper now. "Did you just say you didn't make a mistake?" The boy nodded. "Yes, sir. I did everything exactly as I intended." A few students exchanged glances, sensing something unusual was happening. The teacher narrowed his eyes. "Oh? Then perhaps you'd like to explain to the class why your answer was wrong?" "It wasn't wrong," the boy said simply. "It was different." The room went so silent that even the distant hum of the hallway outside felt deafening. The teacher let out a forced chuckle, but there was something nervous about it. "Different doesn't mean correct. You see, there's a right way and a wrong way. And in this class, we do things the right way." The boy exhaled slowly, as if deciding whether or not this conversation was even worth his time. Then, finally, he spoke. "Is that so?" he asked. "Then tell me, sir, is history written by the ones who followed rules, or by the ones who dared to challenge them?" The entire classroom tensed. Somewhere in the back, a student let out a barely audible "whoa." The teacher's expression darkened. His grip tightened on the marker in his hand. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in front of a full classroom. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he muttered. The boy shrugged. "Not really. I just believe that real learning doesn't come from memorizing what we're told. It comes from understanding why things work the way they do." A few students nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension thickening by the second. The teacher's jaw clenched. He had been in this profession for years, he had seen plenty of so-called smart students before. But something about this boy unnerved him. "Well," the teacher said, forcing a smile, "if you think you're so smart, maybe you'd like to prove it?" The challenge was clear. The boy leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "Are you offering me a chance to?" The teacher's smirk returned. "Why not? If you think your way is better, then let's put it to the test." The students murmured among themselves. Was this really happening? A student going head-to-head with a teacher? But the boy didn't look intimidated. In fact, for the first time since the conversation started, a small smile played at the corners of his lips. "I accept." The room went still. The teacher hadn't expected that. He had assumed the boy would back down or at least hesitate. But no, his answer had been immediate. The teacher's smirk faded slightly. "Good," he said, masking his unease. "Then let's see if you're as smart as you think you are." The boy nodded once. "Oh, don't worry," he said. "You'll see." And just like that, something irreversible had been set in motion. Whatever happened next, whatever challenge was about to unfold, it was clear that neither the teacher or the students would ever forget this moment. Because this was not just about one student proving a point. It was about something much bigger. And no one, not even the teacher, was ready for what was coming next. The room still held its silence, thick and suffocating. No one had ever challenged the teacher like that before, not in this school, not in this classroom. Most students had learned the unspoken rule: don't question authority. Don't challenge the system. Stay quiet, do what's expected, and move on. But this boy, he wasn't playing by the same rules. The teacher cleared his throat, forcing a smirk. "All right then," he said, leaning against his desk. "Let's make this interesting. Since you believe in thinking differently, I'll give you a challenge. A test of intelligence, not memorization." The students murmured in hushed tones, glancing at the boy to see if he would back down. He didn't. Instead, he folded his hands together, his gaze steady. "I'm listening." The teacher hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. He had expected nervousness, hesitation, maybe even fear. But this student was completely composed, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Fine. If the boy wanted a challenge, he'd get one. "All right," the teacher said, standing straighter. "Let's see how well you think on your feet. Here's a scenario: you are an astronaut stranded in space. Your oxygen supply is running out, and the only way to survive is to fix your communication system to call for help. But the tools you have are limited. You have a broken antenna, a faulty circuit board, and only 15 minutes before you lose consciousness." The class leaned in slightly, drawn into the scenario. The teacher crossed his arms. "What do you do?" A challenge in front of the entire class. A test not of memorization, but of ingenuity. Most students would have hesitated. They would have panicked, stumbled through half-formed ideas. Not this one. The boy exhaled slowly, his mind already working. Then he spoke, his words deliberate. "First," he said, "I wouldn't waste time trying to repair the antenna directly. The circuit board is faulty, which means the issue isn't just about sending a signal, it's about making sure it gets received. I would strip the insulation from any non-essential wires, using them to create a makeshift bypass circuit. That way, I could reroute power to stabilize the outgoing transmission." The students blinked. Even a few of them who normally didn't pay attention had their eyes locked on him. The teacher's smirk faltered. The boy wasn't done. "Next," he continued, "I'd focus on the transmission itself. Since a full message might not get through in time, I would set the system to send a repeating distress pulse instead, short bursts that require less power but increase the chance of detection. Even if my signal is weak, repeating pulses have a better chance of catching a nearby ship's attention." The murmurs in the classroom grew louder. Some students looked at each other, whispering. The teacher's fingers twitched slightly. "But," the boy added, tilting his head, "there's still the oxygen problem. The best way to delay suffocation is to minimize movement. I'd slow my breathing, reduce unnecessary motion, and focus on conserving what little air I have left. If all goes well, the distress signal would be picked up before I lose consciousness." Silence. The teacher hadn't expected that. He had thrown out the challenge expecting hesitation, a stumbling answer, something he could use to knock the boy down a peg. Instead, what he got was a flawless, logical strategy delivered with calm precision. A strategy that made sense. A strategy that, if real, could have actually worked. A few students started nodding in agreement. "That actually makes sense," one whispered. I never would have thought of that, another admitted. The teacher forced a chuckle, trying to regain control of the situation. Interesting answer, he said. But let's be real, how would a student like you know anything about space survival? The boy met his gaze without hesitation. I read, he said simply. I think. I learn. Isn't that the point of being in school? The words hit harder than expected. A few students exchanged glances, sensing the shift in power. For the first time in his career, the teacher felt the weight of a room that was no longer on his side. Well, the teacher said, gripping the edge of his desk a little too tightly. That was just one challenge. Let's see if you can handle another. But the boy only smiled, a small, knowing smile that made it clear, the game had already changed. The classroom air had shifted. A moment ago, the teacher had been in control, holding the power, as he always did. But now, something was different. The balance had changed. The boy had answered his challenge too well. Too quickly. Too intelligently. And the class had noticed. The teacher forced another smirk, but it felt weaker now. All right, he said, rubbing his chin, so you handled that question well. But let's see how well you think when the stakes are higher. He turned to the whiteboard, writing out a complex equation. The numbers and symbols stretched across the board in a mess of calculations. This, he said, stepping back, is an unsolved problem in theoretical physics. If you can solve it, you're smarter than some of the best minds in history. A few students muttered under their breath. This was different. This wasn't a hypothetical scenario, this was real. Something even experts hadn't figured out. It was an impossible challenge. The boy studied the board for a long moment. His expression didn't change. He didn't panic. He didn't hesitate. Then, calmly, he reached for a marker. A few students gasped as he stood up and walked to the board. The teacher's smirk twitched. What do you think you're doing? The boy tapped the board lightly. You said it's unsolved. That doesn't mean it's impossible. The class was silent. Then, with careful strokes, he started writing. The teacher's amusement faded as he watched. The boy wasn't guessing. His hands moved with purpose, breaking the equation apart, simplifying where necessary, adjusting where things didn't align. The students craned their necks, watching as numbers and symbols transformed into something elegant. 5 minutes passed. The only sound was the soft scratching of the marker against the board. Then, he stopped. He set the marker down and stepped back. There, he said simply. The teacher's stomach tightened. It looked correct. But that wasn't possible. He stepped forward quickly, scanning the solution. His eyes darted across the numbers, looking for the flaw, the miscalculation, the mistake. Nothing. It made sense. For the first time, real panic flickered in the teacher's chest. Because he wasn't sure if the boy had just solved the impossible. The class sat frozen, waiting for the teacher to say something. Finally, the teacher forced a chuckle. Well, he said, voice tight, it's an interesting attempt. But I doubt it's correct. The boy shrugged. You asked me to try. He turned, walking back to his seat, his expression calm. But there was something behind his eyes. Something that said, I know what I just did. And so do you. The classroom wasn't the same anymore. Something had shifted. And for the first time in his career, the teacher realized, he might not be the smartest person in the room. The classroom still hadn't recovered from what had just happened. The equation on the board, the impossible problem, stood there, solved. The boy had returned to his seat, calm and composed, while the teacher stared at the board, gripping the marker so tightly his knuckles turned white. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The teacher had expected a mess of incorrect numbers, a desperate attempt that he could easily dismiss. He had planned to use it as a lesson, a way to remind the class that he was the authority in this room. But instead, the boy had done this. The murmurs started again. Did he actually solve it? Looks right to me. How did he even know where to start? The teacher slammed the marker down on his desk. Enough, he snapped. This is a classroom, not a circus. The room fell silent again, but this time, it wasn't out of respect. It was something else. Something colder. The boy didn't react to the teacher's outburst. He simply kept his hands folded in front of him, waiting. Watching. The teacher cleared his throat, regaining his forced smirk. Well, he said, waving a dismissive hand, it's a nice trick, I'll admit. But real science isn't about quick calculations on a board. It's about rigorous proof, peer review, years of research. So unless you have an advanced degree hidden in that backpack of yours, I suggest you leave the big problems to the professionals. A few students glanced at each other, sensing the shift in tone. This wasn't about education anymore. This was personal. And the boy knew it. Of course, he said, his voice smooth. That makes sense. But tell me, sir, how long has that problem been unsolved? The teacher narrowed his eyes. Decades. And how many people have tried to solve it? Some of the most brilliant minds in mathematics and physics, the teacher said, folding his arms. People far more experienced than you. The boy nodded. So then why does my answer make you so uncomfortable? The class gasped. The teacher's face darkened. A heavy silence followed. The boy didn't smirk, didn't taunt. He simply stated the truth. And that was what made it so dangerous. The teacher let out a forced chuckle. Uncomfortable? Don't be ridiculous. He turned toward the board, quickly wiping away the solution before anyone could analyze it further. The class watched in shock. But the boy? He just smiled. Not in arrogance. Not in victory. But in understanding. Because in that moment, the teacher had admitted everything. And the entire class knew it. The teacher was afraid. Not of losing an argument. Not of being wrong. But of losing control. Because for the first time in his career, a student had done something that he couldn't explain away. And that terrified him. The whiteboard was clean. The teacher had wiped it faster than anyone expected, almost like he was afraid of leaving evidence. The solution was gone, erased in seconds. But the class had seen it. And more importantly, they had seen him. The boy sat back in his chair, his expression neutral, but there was a quiet certainty in his posture. He didn't need to fight anymore. The truth was already out. But the teacher wasn't done. He had been humiliated in front of his own students. He had been challenged, outmaneuvered, and forced into a corner. He needed to regain control. All right, the teacher said, clearing his throat and forcing a smirk. Enough games. This is a classroom, not a debate club. Let's move on to today's lesson. He turned to his desk and picked up the textbook, flipping to a random page. He needed a distraction, something to reset the power dynamic. But the students weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at the boy. And that was the real problem. For the first time, the teacher wasn't the most respected person in the room. He felt it slipping away, and the more he tried to ignore it, the heavier it became. The boy, however, said nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't gloat. He simply sat there, quietly watching. And that was worse than anything else. Because the moment the teacher lost his temper again, he knew, he would lose everything. He needed to shift the focus. He needed a new plan. All right, the teacher said again, forcing a casual tone. Since you all seem so interested in independent thinking, how about we put it to the test? A few students hesitated. What do you mean? One of them asked. The teacher smirked. We're going to have a competition. A real one. Not some silly math stunt, but a test that requires actual knowledge, preparation, and skill. Some students started whispering. The teacher continued, glancing at the boy. You seem to think you know everything, so here's your chance to prove it. Next week, there's an academic decathlon. Different subjects, science, literature, logic. If you really want to show me I'm wrong, then win. A few students gasped. An academic decathlon? Against the best students in the school? That was a trap. The teacher had found his way out. He wasn't going to fight the boy in a battle of words anymore. He was going to throw him into a challenge he couldn't possibly prepare for. He was going to set him up to fail. But the boy? He only tilted his head. You want me to compete? He asked. The teacher nodded. Unless you're afraid. A challenge. A public challenge. If the boy said no, it would look like he was backing down. The teacher knew it. The class knew it. The room held its breath. And then, the boy nodded once. All right, he said. The teacher blinked. What? I'll do it, the boy repeated. I'll compete. The students murmured in excitement. Some of them whispered, he's actually doing it. The teacher had expected hesitation. He had expected an excuse. But the boy had agreed immediately. The teacher's stomach tightened. Because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. The trap had been set. The bait had been placed. But instead of avoiding it, the boy walked into it willingly. And that made the teacher uneasy. Because for the first time, he wondered, who was really setting up who. The news spread fast. By the next day, the entire school was talking about it. The student who stood up to the teacher was going to compete in the academic decathlon. People whispered in hallways. Does he even have a chance? He's smart, but he's not one of the top competitors. The teacher set him up, he's going to fail in front of everyone. And that was exactly what the teacher was counting on. In his mind, this was checkmate. A one-on-one battle in the classroom? Too unpredictable. But a structured academic competition? That was his world. This was his chance to remind the student, and everyone else, who held the real power. But something strange was happening. The teacher expected the boy to panic. To show signs of doubt. To back out at the last minute. Instead, the boy remained completely calm. Every day, he sat at his desk, quietly taking notes, flipping through books, absorbing information like a sponge. It was unnerving. The teacher watched him closely, trying to find weakness. Trying to find any sign that the boy was in over his head. But the more he observed, the more something became clear. The boy wasn't studying to win. He was studying to understand. And that was what made him dangerous. The day of the competition arrived. The school auditorium was packed. Students, teachers, even members of the district administration had come to watch. The academic decathlon wasn't just a school event, it was a prestigious challenge, meant for the best and brightest. And now, all eyes were on one unexpected competitor. The teacher watched from the sidelines, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. This was it. The moment the boy would finally crack. The moderator stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. Welcome, everyone, to this year's academic decathlon. We have our top students competing today, as well as one new challenger. A few students in the audience chuckled. The moderator continued, glancing at the lineup. You all know the rules. There will be multiple rounds covering different subjects. The competitor with the highest score at the end will be declared the winner. Let's begin. The first round, mathematics. The teacher leaned forward, watching closely. He knew the boy was intelligent, but math competitions were different. They weren't just about knowledge, they were about speed. The first question appeared on the screen. The timer started. The competitors scribbled their answers furiously. The teacher smirked. This is where he struggles. This is where the boy finished first. The audience gasped. The teacher's smirk disappeared. Correct. The second question. Again, the boy finished first. Correct. The teacher's grip tightened on the edge of his chair. The boy wasn't just keeping up, he was leading. Round after round, the same thing happened. Science. Literature. Logic. History. The boy wasn't just answering correctly, he was answering with a level of understanding that stunned the judges. It wasn't memorization. It wasn't tricks. It was pure comprehension. And the audience knew it. The whispers began. Where did he come from? How is he this good? Is this really happening? And the teacher. For the first time in his career, he felt something he had never felt before. Not irritation. Not annoyance. Fear. Because he had lost control. This wasn't just about a student proving a point anymore. This was about the truth. And the truth was stronger than anything he had to fight back with. The final round approached. Only one competitor remained neck and neck with the boy, a senior who had been training for this competition for years. The final question appeared. A complex problem, designed to test everything. A hush fell over the audience. The competitors scribbled. Calculated. Analyzed. The teacher's hands clenched into fists. He needed this. He needed this final round to be his win. 30 seconds left. The senior competitor's hand shot up. He had his answer. The audience held its breath. The judge examined the paper. A pause. Then, incorrect. A collective gasp. The teacher's eyes widened. The senior competitor looked devastated. And the boy? He was still writing. The timer ticked down. 5. 4. 3. The boy calmly placed his pencil down and lifted his hand. The judge took the paper. The entire room leaned forward, waiting. Silence. Then, correct. The auditorium erupted. The teacher sat completely frozen. He had lost. Not just a competition. Not just a battle of knowledge. He had lost his authority. His power. And worst of all, he had lost it to the truth. The applause thundered through the auditorium. Students, teachers, and even some of the district officials were on their feet. Some clapped hesitantly, still trying to process what had just happened. Others cheered without hesitation. But everyone knew one thing. The boy had won. And not just the competition. He had won the moment. The moment that changed everything. He stood on the stage, still calm, still composed, while the judges reviewed the final scores. There was no shock in his expression. No disbelief. Because he had always known the outcome. The moderator stepped forward, raising the microphone. And with that final answer, we have our winner. A roar of applause followed. But the teacher, he couldn't move. Couldn't clap. Couldn't even breathe. Because this wasn't how the story was supposed to go. He was supposed to be the authority. He was supposed to be the one they respected. And yet, right now, the entire school was looking at someone else. Someone younger. Someone who wasn't him. Someone who had just rewritten the rules. The moderator gestured to the boy. Would you like to say a few words? The teacher felt his chest tighten. No. No, no, no. This was his last chance. His final hope. If the boy spoke well, if he won the crowd completely, then everything would change forever. The boy took the microphone, glancing at the cheering students. He waited until the noise settled, until the auditorium was silent again. Then, in the same steady voice he had always used, he spoke. "I didn't compete today to prove I was the smartest person in the room," he said. "I competed because I believe learning isn't about memorizing answers. It's about understanding. Thinking for yourself." The audience listened intently. "I didn't win today because I studied the hardest," the boy continued. "I won because I looked at the problems differently. And anyone can do that, if they're given the chance." The teacher stiffened. The boy turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward him. "That's why teachers matter," he said. "Because real teachers don't just tell students what to think. They teach them how to think." A deep silence filled the room. The words lingered in the air. The teacher's stomach dropped. He knew. He knew exactly what the boy was saying. The students knew it too. They weren't just looking at the boy anymore. They were looking at him. And in that moment, the teacher realized something terrifying. He wasn't the lesson anymore. He was the warning. The silence stretched through the auditorium, heavier than any applause could have been. The boy stood on the stage, microphone in hand, his words still hanging in the air. And the teacher? He felt small. For years, he had controlled his classroom with an iron grip. His word was final. His authority was absolute. He had crushed students with nothing more than a look, a dismissive remark, a carefully planned public humiliation. But now it was different. Because his usual weapons weren't working. The boy hadn't fought back with anger. He hadn't argued, he hadn't disrespected him, he hadn't even insulted him. He had simply told the truth. And the truth was more powerful than any authority the teacher had ever held. The moderator finally broke the silence. "Wise words," he said, clearing his throat. "And now, let's present the championship medal to our winner." The audience erupted into applause again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't just excitement. It was belief. The students weren't just celebrating a victory. They were celebrating what the victory meant. One by one, students started standing. Some clapped. Some nodded. Some just watched, their expressions filled with something new. Respect. Not for the teacher. For the student. The moderator placed the medal around the boy's neck, shaking his hand. The photographers flashed their cameras. The school administration nodded approvingly. But the teacher? He couldn't move. His hands clenched at his sides. His jaw tightened. Because for the first time in his career, he wasn't important. No one was looking at him anymore. No one was afraid of him. And without that fear, what was left? The boy stepped down from the stage, the crowd parting for him. Students he had never even spoken to clapped him on the back, whispered congratulations. But as he walked past the teacher, he paused. Just for a second. Not out of arrogance. Not out of pride. But out of understanding. The teacher looked at him, expecting to see gloating. Instead, he saw something worse. Pity. Because the boy wasn't just challenging him anymore. He felt sorry for him. And that hurt more than anything. The boy gave him a small nod, as if acknowledging something unspoken, and then he walked away. The teacher stood there, his fingers trembling slightly, his heart hammering in his chest. He had lost. And the worst part? He knew he had deserved it. The school hallways buzzed with a new energy. The academic decathlon had ended, but the real competition, the battle for truth, had already been won. The boy had walked away not just as the champion, but as the one who changed everything. Teachers whispered. Students looked at each other differently. Something had shifted. And the teacher, he felt it everywhere. The way students no longer shrank when he entered a room. The way they questioned instead of blindly obeying. The way the air had changed in his own classroom. He was no longer feared. He was no longer powerful. And without that, what was he? The next morning, the teacher sat at his desk, staring at an empty whiteboard. For the first time in years, he felt lost. He had built his career on being the smartest person in the room. On control. On making sure no student ever challenged him. But now, one student had. And instead of breaking, that student had thrived. And instead of failing, that student had won. The door to the classroom opened. The boy walked in, his steps steady, his eyes sharp. The teacher stiffened slightly. Class doesn't start for another 10 minutes. I know, the boy said. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from the teacher's desk. The silence stretched. The teacher expected arrogance. A final, smug remark. But the boy just sat there, watching him. And then, he asked a question the teacher never expected. Why did you become a teacher? The words hit harder than they should have. The teacher frowned. What? The boy leaned forward slightly. At some point, you wanted to teach. Not control, not intimidate, teach. Why? The teacher opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because he didn't remember. When had it changed? When had he stopped teaching and started controlling? The boy tilted his head. I don't think you're a bad teacher. I think you just forgot why you started. The teacher's fingers twitched. He should have dismissed the boy. He should have told him to leave. But instead, for the first time in years, he listened. The boy stood, adjusting his bag. You can keep teaching the way you always have, he said. Or you can change. It's up to you. Then, without another word, he walked away. The teacher sat there, staring at the empty chair. For the first time, he thought about what kind of teacher he really wanted to be. And for the first time, he thought about changing. The lesson that echoed forever. The competition ended. The semester moved on. But the lesson that boy taught? It never faded. The teacher never forgot it. Because in the end, the boy didn't just win a decathlon. He changed a system. He changed a mindset. And in the end, that was a victory far greater than any medal.